Hi, it's Kiffin Lobates here, and video 2 in a series based loosely around segregated witness. And today I'm going to try to explain the transaction malleability flaw, although some people would debate that it's not actually a flaw. So in the previous video you may remember that I used an analogy comparing the inputs and outputs of a Bitcoin transaction to bank checks. They contain a sum to pay, who to pay it to, and an authorizing signature, or an authorizing challenge where you have to sign in order to claim. Now, in the transaction malleability flaw, the attacker takes advantage of the fact that in the original Bitcoin protocol, you only sign the core part of the transaction. You can have other things going on in the transaction that aren't relevant to the transfer of Bitcoins, but can be done anyway. And the problem with this is that if you make a slight change to these extra parts, then the transaction gets a new transaction ID, and I'll explain why that's significant in a moment. So back to the check analogy, it's almost like the check has 2 pages and you only sign the second page. And this is a problem with traditional contracts, and I guess a check is kind of like a contract. If you get a multi-page contract and you only sign the last page, then people could pull out page 3 and replace it with something else. That's why you should always initial all the pages of a contract that you sign. And in the transaction malleability flaw, what happens is I send some Bitcoins to another party. They spot that transaction and they take it and they duplicate it, but make a slight difference to, say, the beginning of it. Now it has a different transaction ID, and they submit this second transaction as quickly as they can. And now there's a race between my original transaction and this other transaction. They both have the same effect. They transfer the same number of Bitcoins to the same person if they get onto the block. Now, if the second transaction actually succeeds, then the second phase of the attack can take place, which is that, and it's actually a social attack, not a technical one at this point. The person then gets back to me and says, hey, that transaction never went through. I never got the Bitcoins that you were supposed to send me. And if I only go and check whether or not my transaction ID made it onto the blockchain, then I'll see, oh, the transaction disappeared, at which point I may resend the money. And in fact, what I'm doing then is sending a second amount of money. So this flaw only works if I don't go and check my address and say, no, hang on a minute, the funds have come out of my Bitcoin address and gone to your address. They've just done it under a different transaction ID. Then the flaw doesn't matter. The attack has failed. But if you're not checking properly, then you could get conned into sending the same funds twice. And this is what MtGox claimed happened to them, that they lost over 700,000 Bitcoins because people were using this attack on them, and presumably they were using a custom piece of software to handle transactions, verify if they went through, and then resend them if they didn't. And that, in short, is the transaction malleability flaw explained. I hope it makes sense, and there'll be another video on this topic tomorrow. Bye for now.